I hadn't even taken off my jacket when I felt it. His stare, slow and steady, dragging across my back as I leaned down to untie my shoes. It wasn't the stare of a brother, not this time. The laces slipped through my fingers when I glanced up and saw his reflection in the hallway mirror, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his eyes flicked away before returning before he caught himself and turned toward the kitchen, pretending he hadn't been watching at all. My breath caught. Not from surprise, but recognition, because I'd been watching him too, just as carefully, pretending it was nothing, while somewhere deep down I knew it wasn't. Jake had moved back home 3 weeks ago, said it was just until he figured things out after his lease ended. But now his socks were draped on the back of the couch and his cologne lived in our shared hallway. And every night he lingered a little too long in doorways with that calm, unreadable expression, that like I was navigating something unfamiliar and too intense for comfort. We'd always joked that he was my almost brother, my stepfather's son from the marriage before this one. But the truth was I'd never seen him that way. Not really. Not since last summer when he came home from Colorado looking broader, quieter, and nothing like the boy who used to tease me for stealing the last ice cream sandwich. Now, every time we crossed paths in the hallway or reached for the same glass, I felt it. Not tension exactly, but something close, like a thread. Being pulled between us, tighter each day, thinner, more dangerous. Even the silences had changed. When we played cards after dinner, I couldn't focus. Not with the way he tapped his fingers against the table in slow, thoughtful rhythms. Not with how he seemed more aware of me than before, watching too long, too quietly. And then it happened. The moment that split the night wide open and lodged itself into my skin. "You really don't know how to kiss?" he asked, half laughing as he fanned his cards like he hadn't just said something ridiculous. I scoffed, cheeks flushing, even as I forced a grin. "Says who?" I shot back, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me, cracked just slightly at the end. "Maybe I do," I added, tossing a card too hard onto the table. He tilted his head, that familiar smirk flickering at the edge of his mouth. "Should I test the theory?" he said, and then softer, almost like a dare, just for practice, just as friends. The joke should have landed. I should have laughed. I should have thrown a pillow at him or rolled my eyes or gotten up to grab a soda from the fridge, but instead I froze, blinked, and stared right at him. The room felt smaller suddenly, the space between us hot and charged and heavy, and I swear I heard the hum of the fridge rise a notch like even the house had. Caught on. I waited for him to laugh, to break it with some dumb grin and say he was kidding, but he didn't, and I didn't move either. That night in bed, I kept reliving it, the way his eyes didn't flinch, the way he said, "just friends," like it meant something different, something layered and secret and almost sweet. My fingers hovered over my phone, half considering texting him something stupid, but instead I messaged Sophie. "He's different, calmer, like a storm you see. Before it hits, but you're not afraid of it." I paused, biting my lip, then deleted the next line. "I wonder how he kisses." Because I already knew that wasn't a joke. The next morning, I tried to act like everything was still the same, like the air between us hadn't changed texture, like I hadn't spent half the night wide awake staring at the ceiling with the echo of his voice spinning in circles around my head. But the problem with pretending is that your body always betrays you first. And mine already moved differently when he entered the room. A hitch in my breath, a flick of my fingers against the countertop, a half-second pause before saying something ordinary. He walked in wearing the same gray t-shirt I used to steal. Back when we were both younger and dumber and nothing between us ever held weight. And now, that same soft cotton draped over his chest in a way that felt too familiar and entirely new at once. And when he looked at me, not with surprise, but with that calm steadiness I'd started to recognize as intention, I dropped my spoon into the sink with a clatter that made him smirk without saying a word. We didn't speak for several minutes, and the silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't tense either. It was a third thing, like both of us were waiting to see if the other would crack first. And even as I stirred cereal I didn't want and leaned against the fridge like I was deep in thought about nothing, I could feel the weight of his presence behind me, the way his eyes lingered near my shoulder blades, the way my body flushed, with heat even though the room was perfectly still. Eventually, I escaped into my room with some half-hearted excuse about needing to call my mom, and I lay back across my old bed, still made up with high school throw pillows and floral sheets that didn't match the person I felt like anymore. And even as I held the phone to my ear, listening to my mom talk about hotel towels and overpriced coffee, my mind kept drifting back to Jake's voice. Not the words, but the tone, the warmth in that awful suggestion he made the night before, the casual way he'd offered to teach me how to kiss as if it were nothing but also everything. That evening, I didn't mean to dress differently. I didn't even think about it until I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The way the loose neckline of my t-shirt slid off one shoulder, the way the hem of my shorts clung just a little tighter than I remembered, the way I stood there, motionless for a full minute, before forcing myself to walk downstairs and act like none of it meant anything at all. Jake was already on the couch, stretched out with one arm behind his head and a remote dangling from the other, and he looked up just long enough to meet my eyes before glancing back at the TV. But the glance was enough, because I saw it, that subtle shift in his expression, the one that always came right before a challenge or a joke or some kind of trouble. I sat across from him on the floor, knees pulled up, cards spread out between us, pretending to care about the score as we played through the usual routine, but the usual rhythm was off. His smile lingered too long, my fingers fumbled more than they should, and the conversation dipped into slower pools that felt less like banter and more like confession with the edges filed off. At one point, he asked if I was still thinking about what he said last night, and I laughed too quickly, shaking my head with a sharpness that didn't match the way my hands curled into fists against my knees. And when he tilted his head, watching me like he already knew the answer, I threw a card at him just to break the tension, only to freeze when he caught it midair and said, without a hint of irony, "I was serious, you know, if you ever want to practice." The words hit harder than I wanted them to, not because they were indecent or ridiculous, but because he didn't flinch when he said them. And suddenly I was aware of every inch of my body, every inhale that wasn't steady, every thought I'd tried to bury since the moment I walked back into this house and saw him standing barefoot in the kitchen, like he belonged to a memory I hadn't finished living through. I didn't respond. Not right away, not with words, but I didn't move either, and he didn't press, just held my gaze for one breath longer than he should have before going back to the game like nothing had happened. And that was the worst part. The ease. The patience, the knowing. When I went to bed that night, I typed a message to Sophie 3 separate times before finally settling on, "He's calmer than before." Like the kind of quiet that comes before something you can't undo. It doesn't feel wrong. It feels close. I hovered over the keyboard before erasing the last sentence I wanted to send, the one I couldn't admit even to her. And maybe I want to know how close it can get. The house felt too quiet the moment the front door clicked shut behind my parents, their car already humming in the driveway, suitcases thudding into the trunk with the kind of careless rhythm that made me certain they wouldn't be back until Sunday night. And as the gravel crunched beneath the tires and the engine disappeared down the road, I stood at the window barefoot, holding a coffee mug I didn't need, wearing my oldest cotton t-shirt that dipped off one shoulder and a pair of sleep shorts, so worn they had become soft as skin, never imagining for a second that walking around like that might read as anything other than comfort. Jake hadn't come downstairs yet, or if he had, he'd done it quietly. But I could hear the muffled creak of the old floorboards above the kitchen, and every time one groaned, my body responded before I even realized it. Like muscle memory was already mapping out every step he took without my permission. And by the time I turned back toward the kitchen to make eggs, I didn't feel like eating. He was standing in the doorway, shirt half tucked, eyes heavy but alert in that familiar way that never failed to pull something taut inside me. He didn't say good morning, just lifted his chin slightly in that half-greeting he always gave when he wasn't sure what to say. And I didn't offer much in return, only a sideways glance as I reached for the salt with hands that felt suddenly too visible, my shoulder brushing against the fridge door just to have something cool grounding me. But he stepped forward and sat down at the counter like it was any other day, like we hadn't been circling something too big to name all week, and for a moment I believed him, believed it was safe to breathe. The eggs sizzled while I stood with my back to him, spatula in hand, and then his voice cut through the quiet like a thread snapping under pressure. Maybe you really do need a lesson, he said, low, casual, the edge of teasing barely, covering the weight beneath it. And when I turned, confused and flushed, he wasn't looking at me but at my mouth, his eyes flicking just once before he looked back down at the counter, like he hadn't just lit a match between us. I threw the nearest thing I could reach, which happened to be a couch pillow that had no business being in the kitchen, and he caught it clumsily, laughing, not backing down, his smile so smug and familiar it almost erased the heat in my cheeks. Except I didn't walk away this time. Didn't deflect with a joke or bury myself in dishes. I stood there, arms crossed, heart racing, trying to decide whether he was serious or just good at playing. When he stood, the shift in the room was immediate, like something electric passed between us without touch, and he crossed the space slowly, carefully, not looming or pushing, but close enough that I could smell the faint trace of laundry soap on his shirt and the heat from his skin beneath it. And I narrowed my eyes, forcing my voice to stay level as I asked, "You actually want to do this?" And he didn't blink, didn't hesitate, just said, "Only if you don't mind." And then softer, "It's just a game." That word echoed between us. Game. As if it could protect us from what might happen next. As if rules and labels could make this safe. And I nodded once, barely, because even though my pulse was hammering and my breath felt too loud in my chest, I wanted to know what would happen if we stopped pretending just for a second. We stood close, closer than ever, his hands at his sides, mine still wrapped around my elbows, and then he leaned in slowly, eyes searching mine not for permission. He already had that, but for courage. And I gave it by not stepping back, by tilting my chin the tiniest bit upward, and when his lips met mine, the world didn't collapse or explode. It just paused, suspended between the first beat and the second. The kiss was short, barely enough to register, a brush more than a press, and when he pulled back, I almost thought that would be it, that we would laugh and move on and chalk it up to a summer memory neither of us would mention again. But then he leaned in once. More. And this time the kiss deepened. Still gentle, still exploratory, but undeniably real. When it ended, neither of us moved, and then without a word, he kissed me again. Slower now. Intentional. His hand lifting slightly before it fell back down, as if he didn't trust himself to touch me yet, and my breath hitched in my throat, not from nerves, but from the way everything inside me seemed to slip out of balance as I stood completely still and let it happen. And then, just as suddenly, he pulled back like the air had burned, like the space between us had become too sharp to cross, and he sat down across the room without meeting my eyes, while I pretended to flip through a magazine I couldn't read, every cell in my body buzzing, every thought rewinding to that exact second when I stopped pretending I didn't want to know. We sat like that for what felt like an hour, him on the couch with one leg crossed over the other, flipping channels with a kind of absent focus, and me pretending to read the same page in a magazine that I'd been holding upside down for at least 5 minutes. The silence between us not cold or angry, but unnervingly alert, like the air had taken on a new density that neither of us quite knew how to breathe through yet. And while my eyes were on the paper, my thoughts circled like animals pacing behind. A locked gate, restless and cornered, replaying that third kiss. The one that didn't feel like a joke, or even like a lesson, but like something inevitable finally unfolding. I kept wondering if he would say something, if he'd get up and walk out, if he'd laugh and undo it all with a single offhanded remark, but he didn't do any of those things. He just stayed there, legs stretched out, one hand tugging gently at the hem of his t-shirt, the other resting near his jaw, and I realized that he was doing the same thing I was, pretending to be somewhere else while absolutely anchored to what had just happened. Eventually I stood, not because I had anything to do, but because my body couldn't stay still anymore, and I moved toward the bookshelf like I needed something from it, fingers grazing the spines without seeing titles. And when I turned, he was watching me with that same unreadable quiet. Not surprised, not embarrassed, just watching like he wasn't sure which version of me was going to turn around. I leaned against the shelf, letting the edge press into my back just to have something solid behind me, and I asked carefully, without the smile this time, "So what was that?" And he didn't answer right away. didn't even blink, just leaned forward slowly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like he was weighing every word before letting them leave his mouth. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I expected. "It was what it looked like," he said. And when I tilted my head, confused but trying not to show it, he added, "It didn't feel like practice anymore." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because my heart jumped the second he said it, and I needed something to cover the fact that I wanted to kiss him again, more than I wanted answers, more than I wanted clarity. And instead of running from that, I stepped forward, closing the space between us just enough to feel the heat from his knees against my thighs. He looked up at me like he was waiting for a reason not to move. And when I didn't give him one, he stood again, slower this time, like the weight of what we were doing had finally caught up to his body, and we stood in the middle of the room with only a single breath between us. And he asked me again, quieter now, "You're sure this is okay?" I didn't say yes. I just reached for his hand and placed it against my waist, and he took that as the answer it was. And when he kissed me again, it wasn't hesitant, and it wasn't quick. It was warm and steady, and filled with the kind of focused intention that made my knees weaken just enough that I had to grip the back of his shirt to hold myself still. This time, I didn't think about where we were or what day it was or how thin the walls were. I only thought about the quiet weight of his hand near my side made everything feel still beneath the hem of my t-shirt. The way his breath stilled when mine caught. The way he didn't push for more but let the moment build on its own weight, and I let myself lean into it. Not because I wanted to be reckless, but because I didn't want to lie to myself anymore. We broke apart slowly, neither of us quite ready to stop but knowing we had to, and when we stepped back, the distance between us wasn't awkward. It was charged, humming like something half-finished, like the pause before the next part of a song, and we both knew it wouldn't end here, even if we didn't say it out loud. He sat down again, this time farther from me than before, like he was giving me room to retreat if I needed it, and I lowered myself into the armchair across the room, curling one leg beneath me, pretending to scroll my phone even though the screen was black, and the only thing I could hear was my own pulse in my ears and the silence between us stretching, like a wire pulled tight. I didn't look at him again, not because I was ashamed, but because I was afraid that if I did, I'd get up, walk back across the room, and kiss him again, and this time I wouldn't stop. The sunlight poured through, the half-open blinds in thick, golden lines that painted the floor in quiet patterns, and I was still curled under the blanket, my body warm from the memory of yesterday, when I heard his footsteps approaching from the hallway with that slow, measured rhythm that had already become too familiar, too steady, too much like a countdown, and by the time he stepped into the kitchen with a half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth and a teasing glint in his eyes, I knew I wouldn't be able to pretend we hadn't crossed a line, even if no one else knew we had. He leaned against the counter, arms folded casually over his chest, and tilted his head slightly before saying with the softest smirk, "Ready for your next lesson?" And though it was meant as a joke, meant to land with that same lightness we used to carry between us, I felt my voice come out smaller than I intended, quieter than it should have been, when I replied, "What if I don't want you to joke this time?" And for a moment he didn't respond, just watched me like he was reading a shift in the weather, something delicate changing in the air between us that couldn't be named, but was undeniably real. He moved then, slowly, without hesitation, like he already knew the answer. And each step he took made my breath tighten until he was standing in front of me with nothing loud in his posture, no rush in his voice, just that same calm pull I was learning to crave. And when he asked, "Do you want this?" I didn't trust my voice to answer, so I nodded once and watched the way his eyes flickered like the word itself had touched something deeper inside him. His hands found my waist first, not rough or urgent, but firm and steady, and my arms moved without thought, fingers rising to trace along the edge of his jaw before sliding into his hair, anchoring me to the moment with a kind of gravity I didn't know I'd been waiting for. And when his mouth met mine, it was no longer tentative or playful, but full and sure, a kiss that felt more like a realization than an impulse. And I met it with all the breath I had left, drawn in by the closeness, by the familiarity that had been quietly building between us. We broke apart just long enough to find each other's eyes again, And when he took my hand and gently led me toward the bed like there was nothing strange or wrong about it, like this was simply where we were supposed to go, I followed with a heart pounding too loud and a body that already knew where to fit against his. And when we lay down side by side, facing each other, the silence between us was thick with everything. We didn't say, and I felt the way his body aligned to mine, not with urgency but with precision, like we had time, like we understood that this wasn't about the surface anymore. His fingers moved first, lightly brushing the edge of my shoulder, tracing a line so slow it made my stomach tighten. And as they drifted lower, grazing along the slope of my arm and then the dip of my waist, I felt my breath start to stutter. Not from fear or shame, but from how careful he was being, how fully present each movement felt, like every inch of skin was being discovered for the first time. Not claimed, just seen. I closed my eyes, not to hide, but to feel it deeper. The way his hand paused, just beneath my ribs before sliding across my back with the kind of pressure that made me arch into him slightly without meaning to, and he didn't speak, didn't ask, just adjusted his hand, as if he already understood what my body was asking for. Before I could form it into thought, and I felt myself soften against him, my head tucked under his chin, my legs tangling with his as if they belonged there. There was nothing fast, nothing bold, just breath and skin, and the soft rhythm of two people figuring out how not to break what had already begun, and I felt the hum of tension rise like a slow tide in my chest, that unmistakable pull that made my thighs tighten and my hands grip the edge of his shirt, needing to anchor myself against the current we were drifting into. And then just as the quiet started to thicken, just as my breath began to fall into sync with his, and I rested my hand against the side of his shirt, anchoring myself, the front door slammed open with a burst of sound that didn't belong to us, and in a second that shattered the stillness. I heard the clatter of keys hit the counter and a voice, my mother's, calling out casually, "We're home early," as if she hadn't just stepped into a room that was about to change everything. The panic ripped through me so fast I couldn't breathe, my fingers scrambling for the blanket, my body instinctively pulling away from Jake even as his eyes widened. With the same disbelief, and just as I yanked the covers to my chest and pressed my back against the wall, the door flew open and Carol stood there, frozen mid-step, mouth slightly open, and behind her, Mark's voice exploded. "Are you out? Of your minds?" Before either of us could even sit up. Jake jumped to his feet, hands up like he'd just stepped into traffic, and I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but hold the blanket to my body with trembling fingers, feeling my entire world collapse inward in a second that felt both silent and deafening at once. And in that moment, everything I had tried to pretend was just a game turned to ash between us. My fingers clutched the edge of the blanket so tightly I thought my knuckles would crack from the pressure, my chest rising in uneven, shallow gasps as I stared past Jake's, back at Carol's frozen silhouette in the doorway. And for a long, terrifying second, no one moved. The house itself seeming to fall silent, except for the pounding in my ears and the wild, jagged flutter of something too raw to be named catching in my throat, and when Mark finally stepped in behind her, the heat in his voice struck like a slap, sharp and disbelieving, tearing through the stillness with a rage that left no room for air. Jake didn't try to explain, didn't speak, didn't gesture or plead. He just stood there, shoulders squared, arms tense at his sides, breathing hard through his nose like he was bracing for impact, and I saw the way his fingers curled. And uncurled once before, he turned halfway toward them, eyes dark with something that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't far from it either. And when he opened his mouth, it wasn't to defend himself, but to say, quietly and too late, "We didn't mean—" But Mark was already past the threshold, already stepping toward him with that kind of father anger that doesn't wait for reasons. And when he shouted again, "You didn't mean what? That we'd walk in on this? That we wouldn't see what the hell was going on in our own house?" The force of it hit like a wave, sending Jake a full step back, not from fear, but because the shame had started to rise fast behind his eyes, and I knew he wasn't going to fight it, because part of him thought we deserved it. Carol didn't raise her voice, but somehow that made it worse, the way she stood there staring at me with a disappointment so deep it hollowed out my ribs, her eyes scanning my face, my bare shoulders, the tangle of limbs and fabric we had barely managed to pull apart in time. And she didn't have to say anything for me to feel like I had shrunk to the size of a single mistake, a single breath, A single kiss that had gone too far and now stood naked in the middle of the room for everyone to see. I couldn't bring myself to speak. Not when Mark's voice filled the space between us with words I couldn't unhear. Not when Carol finally turned away, covering her mouth with one trembling hand as if the sight of me had been too much to bear. Not when Jake took another step back and said my name so softly it nearly broke me. Emily, like a plea, like a goodbye, like he already knew this couldn't be undone. The blanket clung to my skin, damp with sweat and panic, and I kept holding it as if it were the only thing tethering me to the floor, because beneath it, every part of me was shaking. Not from cold, but from the way everything we had allowed ourselves to feel in private had now been dragged into the light, exposed and raw and impossible to defend. And as I sat there, lips parted, throat dry, I realized I hadn't blinked since the moment the door opened. Mark's voice dropped finally, but the fury stayed in his posture, in the clench of his jaw, and the way he looked at Jake like he had never seen him before, and I could feel the disappointment moving through the room like a storm. Quiet only because it had nothing left to destroy in words, only silence and consequences. And when he pointed toward the hallway and said, "Get dressed, both of you," I thought for a moment the floor might actually split open beneath me. Jake didn't move right away, didn't argue or push back, only nodded once and reached for his shirt, and the moment his back was turned, I slipped out of bed with the blanket wrapped around me like a shield, my legs unsteady as I moved toward the door, unable to meet anyone's eyes, unable to process the weight of the shame settling into my chest like stone. In the bathroom, I stood with the door locked behind me, back against the wall, blanket still clutched tight as if I could hide from the memory of what we'd almost let happen, and I stared at my reflection in the mirror, cheeks flushed, hair tangled, lips swollen from something that had felt so real just minutes ago, and I wondered how it had all shifted so quickly from breathless to broken. I could still feel the heat of Jake's hands on my skin, the closeness of his presence beside me, matching each other's stillness, our breaths slowly falling into rhythm like it was meant to be that way. And now it felt like a ghost I wasn't allowed to remember, like something sacred that had been shattered not by what we did, but by the brutal speed with which it was taken from us. And as I slid down the wall and buried my face in my hands, the only thing I could think was that I hadn't even had time to regret it before the world had already decided for me. Because there hadn't been a plan, there hadn't been a future, there hadn't even been a real decision, just a current. That had pulled us forward and a moment we'd let carry us because it felt too honest to fight. And now all that honesty was scattered in pieces across the hallway, and I didn't know which one of us would be asked to clean it up first. By the time the sun slipped behind the trees and the rest of the house fell into that uneasy kind of silence that comes only after shouting has exhausted everyone into avoidance, I had already locked myself in my room and buried my face into the same pillow I had hugged when I was 15 and afraid of exams or the first sting of a heartbreak. Only now I wasn't afraid of consequences or punishments or what came next. I was afraid of myself, of the heat still lingering on my skin, of the aching truth that I hadn't been dragged into that moment with Jake, that I had wanted it so completely, it burned through every layer of shame that followed. And as I lay there, body curled in on itself, palms trembling against the damp cotton of the pillowcase, the worst part wasn't guilt. It was knowing that I would say yes again if no one had walked through that door. My phone buzzed once, then again, and I ignored it at first, thinking it was one of those empty notifications, or maybe just someone checking in without really wanting to hear the answer. But when it buzzed a third time and the screen lit up with Zach's name, the boy I had once called mine, the one who knew how I liked my coffee and which side of the bed I always rolled toward in my sleep, I felt a twist of nausea in my stomach, the kind that comes when the past collides with a version of yourself you can't justify. I answered because part of me still owed him that, or thought I did, and his voice came through warm and familiar, laced with that easy charm that used to make my heart race before it started to feel more like a pattern I couldn't change. And he said, "I miss you, Em. I was thinking of coming. Up this weekend, we can talk, maybe get some space together." And I wanted so badly to disappear into that offer, to pretend that version of me still existed, the one that belonged neatly in someone else's expectations. But instead, I closed my eyes and whispered, "Don't." And when he hesitated and asked, "What do you mean?" I didn't soften. I just said, "It's over, Zach." And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was stunned, heavy, trying to find ground it had already lost. He stammered something. I think it was my name. Maybe a question. Maybe disbelief, but I didn't wait to hear the rest. I ended the call and let the phone slip from my hand onto the carpet, my breath catching as I stared at the ceiling like it might offer some kind of answer, something to tell me whether what I felt was relief or regret. And when the tears came, they weren't sharp or loud. They were slow and confused, spilling sideways into the pillow like my body couldn't decide whether it was mourning what I had broken or grateful that I had finally stopped pretending I hadn't already broken it months ago. The house stayed quiet, footsteps muffled behind, doors that didn't open, and somewhere past midnight, when the air had grown heavy and the hallway light had dimmed to a soft gold beneath the doorframe, I heard the sound. 3 soft taps, careful and uncertain, like a question pressed into wood. And I knew it was him, because no one else would knock at that hour, and no one else would stay after everything had burned down the way it had. I didn't answer, didn't breathe, just lay frozen in the dark. As his voice came through the door, low and hesitant, the first thing I'd heard from him since the explosion that had torn through all the walls between us, and he said, "I didn't want it to go that far," his voice catching slightly before, continuing, but I wasn't pretending. That last sentence clung to the air like smoke, refusing to fade, and I sat up slowly, dragging the blanket with me, feet cold against the hardwood as I crossed the room and unlatched the door, opening it just enough to see him sitting there, knees pulled up, arms resting over them, looking like he had aged 3 years in a single night, and when his eyes met mine, he didn't flinch or apologize or ask for permission. He just said, "If this ruins you, I'll leave." And it wasn't a threat or a bargain, it was a promise that broke something open in my chest. I sank to the floor beside him without thinking, not close enough to touch, not far enough to feel apart, just there in the same stretch of hallway where childhood used to echo in laughter and doors left half open. And now the silence between us wasn't empty. It was dense with everything that had passed between our mouths and hearts. And I turned to him, throat tight, voice barely a breath, and said, "You didn't ruin me. You lit something I couldn't see before." He didn't reach for me, and I didn't reach for him. But we stayed there side by side on the hardwood, backs against the same wall, shoulders nearly aligned but not touching, listening to each other's breath like it was the only honest sound left in the house, and maybe in that moment, without even speaking, we both understood that nothing would ever be the same. Not because we broke the rules, but because we had finally told the truth. We didn't speak again for what felt like hours, the kind of silence that doesn't ache but settles, like breath finding its rhythm again after being held too long. And even though his shoulder was only inches from mine, even though the wood beneath us had started to press into the back of my legs, and the draft creeping down the hallway raised goosebumps across my arms, I didn't move, because being there with him, still and quiet, felt more honest than anything I'd said aloud in days. And I was afraid that if either of us broke the stillness, we would shatter the fragile shape of whatever this was trying to become. I stole glances at him, watching the way his fingers tapped softly against his knee, a rhythm without melody, just movement, maybe to keep his thoughts from spiraling, maybe to give his hand something to do so he wouldn't reach for me, and I knew without needing to ask that he wanted to. I could feel it in the way his breath hitched when I shifted slightly, in the way his eyes darted toward my face before quickly looking away like he didn't trust himself not to ask for too much too soon. The hallway light flickered once, not out of malfunction, just a reminder of how late it had become. And in that moment, I realized the house had fallen completely. Still, no footsteps, no voices, no interruptions, just the low hum of old walls listening, holding space for 2 people too afraid to stand up and too undone to walk away. And when I finally spoke, my voice came out low and slow, like it had been waiting for permission. "I didn't know I could want something and regret it at the same time," I said, my words heavy but even, and he turned to me then, not suddenly, not dramatically, just a soft movement like he'd been holding his breath for that exact admission. And when our eyes met, I saw none of the boyish charm he used to wear like armor, only the weight of a man who knew he'd crossed a line and was still willing to stay on the other side of it if I asked. He didn't try to defend anything, didn't fill the silence with easy comforts or familiar jokes. He just nodded slowly, the kind of nod that says, "I know." And when he finally answered, his voice was just above a whisper, almost reverent, like he was naming something sacred. "I don't regret what we did," he said, and I held his gaze, not blinking, not flinching, because I needed to hear the rest of it without hiding from it, and he continued, "But I regret how it had to be seen. Like it was shameful, like it was something we'd never thought through, when all I've done this week is think about you." The honesty hit me so sharply I had to close my eyes for a second just to process it, and when I opened them again, he was still looking at me, not asking for anything, just offering himself without pretense, and that scared me more than the shouting or the guilt or even the threat of what might come next, because it meant this wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a choice waiting to be named. I let my head fall back against the wall with a soft thud, the cold paint grounding me as I exhaled, my fingers tightening in the fabric of my sweatshirt as I searched for a way to answer without unraveling, and eventually, I said, "I don't know how to feel," which was the truth, the only truth. I could give him right then, and he nodded again, eyes soft, not disappointed, just patient. We sat there like that for a long time, not touching, not pushing, just breathing together in a quiet that somehow felt more intimate than anything else we'd shared. And as the hours passed, I felt the weight of shame start to shift, not disappear, but move into something I could look at directly. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the part that made me ache wasn't what we did. It was how much I'd wanted it, and how terrifying it felt to admit that wanting something that breaks the rules doesn't always mean it's wrong. I could feel the heat of him beside me, the way his leg barely brushed mine every time he shifted, slightly, and still neither of us moved to close the gap, because maybe we both knew that tonight wasn't about what came next. It was about surviving the quiet after the storm, about learning to sit in the truth without needing to wrap it in excuses or tear it apart for answers. Eventually, I tilted my head and whispered, "They hate me now." And he exhaled slowly before answering, "They're hurt. It's not the same." And I knew he was right. But I also knew that the version of me that existed before today, the good girl, the careful daughter, the safe one, she wasn't coming back. Not because I'd lost her, but because I had finally told the truth about who I really was. And that truth wasn't neat or polite or easily explained. We stayed there until the hallway light dimmed completely, and the chill began to settle into our bones. And even then we didn't get up, didn't say goodnight or try to promise anything. We couldn't keep. We just breathed in silence. Two people sitting on the same floor, under the same weight, still hurting, still unsure, but for the first time, not hiding from it. The kitchen had never felt so hollow, not even in the dead of winter when the windows rattled and the walls seemed to hold their breath. But now, with the four of us seated around the table pretending to chew and swallow and exist like nothing had broken, the air felt tighter than my chest, the clink of cutlery against porcelain louder than the thoughts I couldn't turn off. And though no one raised their voice or made a scene, the silence between us spoke with the force of everything we weren't saying. Each glance too brief, each breath too careful, and with every passing second, I felt the room close in until I wanted to scream just to break the suffocating stillness. Carol moved mechanically, placing a napkin beside Mark's elbow as if she were playing the part of someone who still cared about details, while Mark stared down at his plate like the food might reveal an answer if he cut it carefully enough. And Jake, sitting directly across from me, didn't even try to meet my gaze, his fork sliding through the same piece of chicken over and over again, like the rhythm of motion could erase the memory of hands and breath and everything that had happened in that bedroom, but I could feel the tension rolling off him like heat, and I knew, without words, without looking, that he was barely holding himself together. My appetite had vanished hours ago, replaced by a tight, cold knot in the pit of my stomach that pulsed with every accidental brush of his knee under the table, with every memory that flooded back when I caught the scent of his cologne still faintly clinging to my sweatshirt. And by the time Carol stood without a word and carried her untouched plate to the sink, I felt something sharp press behind my ribs, the kind of ache that comes when a door closes for good, even if no one slams it. Later, when the table had been cleared and the lights dimmed and I had retreated upstairs to the illusion of safety, I found the folded note wedged beneath the edge of my door, the handwriting unmistakably his, blocky and slanted from years of scribbling. Too fast on scraps of paper, and all it said was, "Woods, 7 p.m., like old times." I stared at the words for a long time, unsure if my legs could carry me back into anything that resembled peace, unsure if going would mend something or shatter it entirely. But at 6:50, I was already slipping on a sweater and tying my shoes, with hands that trembled too much to double knot the laces. And when I stepped outside, the evening air hit me with that old familiar sweetness, pine and damp earth and the faint smokiness of a distant fire, the scent of every summer we spent building forts and secrets beneath the trees. He was already there, seated on the faded plaid blanket we used to bring every 4th of July, a thermos beside him, 2 cups, his jacket draped over a tree root, like he'd been waiting long enough to get cold. And when he looked up and saw me standing at the edge of the clearing, he didn't smile or speak, just shifted slightly to the side and patted the space next to him in a quiet invitation I didn't need to question. I sat slowly, the warmth of the blanket immediately rising through my jeans. And for a few moments, we just sat there in silence, the woods around us humming with insects and wind and the soft rustling of leaves like a breath held between words. And finally, without turning to me, he asked, "Do you still want this?" And instead of answering, I leaned in and kissed him, not with hesitation or fear or apology, but with the kind of certainty that came from weeks of silent longing and one catastrophic moment of truth that refused to leave my bones. His kiss felt grounded, like something sure and undramatic, the kind of kiss that says not only I remember, but I'm still here. And as our lips moved together, slower than before, more complete, I felt my fingers curl into the hem of his sweater and his hand come to rest at the base of my neck, thumb brushing the edge of my jaw like he was mapping out what pieces were still intact. When we finally broke apart, he didn't speak, didn't ask, just reached for the thermos and poured steaming tea into both cups like we had done this 1,000 times before. And I watched the way his hands moved, how steady they were now, how calm, like kissing me had settled something in him that couldn't be settled by distance or silence or shame. We drank in slow sips, the heat warming me from the inside out. And then, wordlessly, we lay back on the blanket, shoulder to shoulder, staring up at the thin blue haze of sky still visible between the tree branches, and his fingers found mine, not possessive or urgent, just sure, threading between mine with a quiet familiarity that broke something soft open in my chest, and I let my eyes drift closed. Not because I was tired, but because feeling him there, just having him near me felt clearer than anything else had all. Week I had known all week. Lying beside him in that clearing where the wind hummed low between the trees and the last traces of daylight clung to the leaves like a memory refusing to fade, I felt his fingers begin to move along the inside of my wrist in slow, deliberate circles, not demanding and not timid, but as if he were tracing a path backward through every choice we had made, every moment of hesitation, every breath we had, shared in secret, and when his hand slipped upward to cradle my elbow and then higher, brushing over the line of my arm and pausing gently on the curve of my shoulder, I didn't pull away or question it. I just breathed deeper, letting my body speak what my mouth was still too afraid to say. He turned onto his side to face me, and I followed, instinctively aligning myself with him as though the space between us was something meant to be closed, not avoided, and his palm found the side of my neck while his thumb rested at the base of my throat. Not pressing, just holding, anchoring, reminding me I was real and still here and wanted. And then his lips found mine again. But this time the kiss was slower and fuller, unbroken by doubt or urgency, the kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything, beyond presence and didn't rush through the moment as if it were afraid of what came next. I let my hand move to his waist, fingers sliding beneath the soft fabric of his shirt and finding the warmth of his skin, and he exhaled into my mouth, a low, involuntary sound that made my stomach clench and my legs pull a little closer, and the moment his arm wrapped gently around my back, steady and calm, chest to chest and knee to knee, I felt every part of my body surrender in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with trust. His mouth left mine only to find its way to my cheek, and then, lower, skimming along the line of my jaw, and I tilted my head slightly, not to give him permission, but because it felt as natural as breathing, and when his hand moved to the small of my back and guided me gently downward until we were pressed together. In full length, I felt my nerves ease for the first time in days, everything slowing, not in sharp release, but in long, warm waves that softened every edge of me. We didn't speak, and we didn't need to. The rhythm between us said everything. Words couldn't carry, and as his fingers traced the side of my rib cage and mine slipped through the back of his hair, I realized that this wasn't about breaking rules or pushing limits anymore. It was about arriving at something we had been circling for far too long. Something that didn't feel like crossing a line but finally stepping into the place we'd been trying not to name. The forest around us stayed still, the world retreating to its quiet rhythm as if giving us permission to just be. And when his hands slowed, resting against my hips with a steady calm, and I adjusted closer to him, as if we'd done this 100 times before. He looked at me with such open stillness that I couldn't breathe for a second. Not because I was afraid, but because nothing about him looked uncertain anymore. And maybe, for the first time, neither did I. He leaned his forehead to mine, and I closed my eyes, and there we stayed, breath against breath, not chasing anything and not holding back. And when I whispered, "I don't want this to end," it wasn't a plea for forever or a vow we couldn't keep. It was the truth of that night, of that hour, of that body against mine, and the closeness that had finally stopped hurting. His voice came low and steady, like it was being spoken directly into my spine, and he said, "It doesn't have to. Not tonight." And then he kissed me again, softer now, like a closing gesture. Or a promise. And we lay there with nothing between us but warmth and breath, and the quiet peace of two people who had nothing left to hide. After, we stayed wrapped in silence, not the heavy kind from the kitchen table or the sharp silence of slammed doors and disappointed parents, but the stillness that comes when everything unnecessary has fallen away, and our hands found each other again, fingers threading together with a kind of ease that felt ancient, like this closeness had been written into us long before we ever realized it. I looked up at the patch of stars blinking through the branches, and my voice came without planning, soft and certain, as I said, "I won't be able to be with anyone else after this." And though it was a terrifying thing to admit, it was more terrifying to imagine pretending otherwise, and when he didn't speak right away, I turned slightly to see his expression, but he was already looking at me like he had heard every part of what I just said before I said it. His reply came like breath against my skin, his fingers still tangled with mine, and he said, "I don't want anyone else either. I haven't for a long time." And the way he said it didn't carry fear or apology, only the kind of calm that comes when you stop running from what you've known all along. And I closed my eyes again, letting my head rest against his chest as the wind moved gently above us, and for once, I didn't brace myself for the world to crash in. The air in the kitchen was already tense when I came downstairs. That heavy, suffocating stillness that hangs between people who have said too much and still not enough. And I knew something final was about to happen the moment I saw Mark standing by the sink with his arms crossed, his jaw locked in that same stiff angle he used when he wanted to stay calm but couldn't hide the weight behind his silence. And when Jake entered the room without looking at me and set his mug on the table like it might break if he held it any longer, the space between them crackled like a storm just before lightning. Mark didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't pace or throw things. He just stood there, still and quiet, and said the words that split the morning open. "You need to leave." And the way he said it wasn't cruel or furious, but final, like a door being shut without slamming. And I watched Jake absorb it without flinching, his head dropping slightly as he nodded once, not because he agreed, but because he knew he had no other choice. And Sarah, who had stood in the corner near the doorway like a shadow all morning, didn't interrupt, didn't object, just looked, down at the floor like the words had been inevitable. I didn't say anything then, not because I didn't want to, but because my voice had lodged somewhere between my ribs and refused to come loose. And as Jake turned to go upstairs and begin packing the life he had just barely started to rebuild, I stood rooted to the floor, fists clenched at my sides, knowing that if I said a single word right now, it might turn into a scream I couldn't take back. Upstairs, I heard drawers opening and the soft creak of his suitcase as it unzipped, the quiet rustle of fabric being folded by hands that had held me just hours before. And when I finally walked into his room, I saw him bent over the side of the bed, carefully placing shirts into neat rows like it would make this easier. And even, though he didn't look up, I knew he heard me, felt me standing there in the doorway like someone holding the edge of a cliff. I stepped forward, still not crying. Not because I wasn't breaking, but because the grief hadn't found its exit yet. And I waited until he turned, his face calm, but pale, eyes tired like he hadn't slept, and I said slowly, with more strength than I thought I still had, "I'm not going to lose you." And the way he exhaled, like that sentence alone had kept him from collapsing, "will stay with me longer than the kiss we didn't dare try again." He crossed the room and took my face in his hands, not kissing, me just holding me like I was something he didn't want to leave behind, and he said, "I'll find a way." And I nodded against his palms because anything else would have cracked the surface I was fighting so hard to keep from breaking. And when he let go, I let him. I didn't watch him carry his bag down the stairs, didn't follow him to the front door, didn't look out the window to watch the car disappear down the drive, because if I had, I knew my body would have run after it before my mind could stop me. So instead, I sat on the edge of his bed, breathing, in the space he'd left behind. And I didn't move for a very long time. Later, when the house had gone quiet again, and the sun shifted low against the far wall of my room, I opened my phone and scrolled through old photos. Not because I wanted to remember, but because I needed to feel what remembering would cost. And when I reached the one of us on the porch last fall, our faces too close, our smiles too knowing, I pressed and held it, thumb hovering over the option to delete. And I did, for half a second before my breath caught and my hand froze, and then I pressed undo, and the image snapped back into place as if it had never left, and I saved it again, this time to a hidden album. I sat with that decision for a long while, letting it settle into my chest, and as the shadows stretched longer across the ceiling, and the day bled into that strange, restless hour where everything feels half real, I opened my messages and started typing without thinking, the words falling into the screen as if they had waited all day to be spoken, and when I read them back, "I choose you," I didn't edit, didn't explain, didn't try to soften it. I just hit send, set the phone down, and closed my eyes. The reply didn't come right away, and even though part of me knew it wouldn't, part of me still kept glancing at the screen every few minutes, not out of desperation, but because I needed to see that the message had landed somewhere, that it hadn't just dissolved into the void between what we were and what we couldn't be yet. And when the screen stayed blank, I took it as a sign not of silence, but of him still thinking, still breathing through the same weight I was trying to carry without falling. I packed that night without telling anyone, not because I was running, but because I finally understood that staying still would only stretch the ache longer, and the ache wasn't something I could afford to nurture anymore. So I folded the essentials, jeans, a sweater, the black shirt he once told me made me look like I belonged somewhere else, and zipped them into the canvas bag I hadn't used since my last semester ended. The one that still smelled faintly of old paper and bus stations and unfamiliar places that had once made me feel anonymous. No one noticed me come downstairs. No one stopped me at the door, and I wasn't sure whether that made it easier or worse. But I stepped outside into the cold morning anyway. The kind of early chill that presses into your clothes no matter how tightly you wrap them around yourself. And with the bag slung over one shoulder, and the silence of the sleeping house behind me, I began the walk toward the edge of town where the buses came and went without asking too many questions. The station was mostly empty, just one man in a heavy coat dozing on a bench, and a woman with a crying baby who didn't look at anyone. And I stood there for a long time beneath the cracked timetable, watching the digital numbers flicker forward and waiting for the right moment to feel like this was real, that I had actually stepped outside the version of myself that waited for permission, for logic, for someone else to fix what I'd broken, by wanting something too much. I bought the ticket without checking where it would leave me. I only knew it was in the direction of where he had gone, and that was enough. And as I sat on the worn bench, fingers tight around the strap of my bag and heart beating in that stubborn, steady rhythm that had carried me through every long day since he left, I let the weight of everything we'd risked settle across my shoulders, not like a punishment, but like a truth I could finally carry with both hands. The bus pulled up slowly, tires hissing against gravel, its headlights cutting through the last layers of fog that hadn't yet lifted, and I stood up without hesitation, blinking against the sharp wind that swept through the shelter and thinking about how strange it was that this, a plastic seat, a ticket in my pocket, a direction, could feel like the most honest decision I'd ever made. I didn't cry when I boarded. Didn't turn back to see if anyone had followed because I already knew no one had. And as I sank into the seat near the window and rested my forehead lightly against the cool glass, I watched the familiar houses blur past, the ones that had defined who I was for so long, and I realized I didn't feel like a version of myself was ending. I felt like something was finally beginning. The phone in my pocket buzzed once, not twice. Not with a call, but with a message. And when I slid it open with hands I hadn't noticed were shaking, I saw only 2 words on the screen. I'm waiting, and my breath caught so sharply I had to close my eyes, pressing the back of my head against the seat, willing my heart to stay quiet long enough for me to hold on to what that meant. I stared down at the message for several minutes, rereading it not because I didn't believe it, but because I did. And when I finally tucked the phone away, I didn't feel nervous or afraid, only steady, like everything in my chest had finally aligned after days of moving in opposite directions. The bus rumbled forward, out of the neighborhood, out of the town, out of the version of my life that had been built, on good intentions and quiet denials. And as the road stretched ahead in a slow, humming rhythm that matched the quiet beat of my pulse, I let my eyes drift toward the horizon, letting myself believe that maybe choosing him wasn't the wrong answer. Maybe it was the only one I had, never dared to speak. I shifted in my seat, tugging the straps of my bag tighter across my shoulder, and with the sky growing lighter and the road unfolding in front of me like something unfinished, I whispered to myself. Not loud, not brave, just true. He isn't my stepbrother. He's the start of something I chose.